Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam ala Rasulil Kareem. Good afternoon, everybody, and Assalamu alaikum. We'll try that again. Good afternoon, and Assalamu alaikum. That's a lot better, isn't it? Yeah? My word. Oh, it's an echo there. Fantastic. Okay, so welcome to, is it North Finchley and Golders Green? Is that strictly speaking the title? It's Finchley and Golders Green, right? Okay, welcome to Finchley and Golders Green Hustings here at the Masjid, alhamdulillah. Now we got, starting from the right-hand side here, your previous MP, I guess, because technically Parliament's been dissolved. Mike Freer, I think, round of applause for Mike, yeah? We got Sarah Sackman as well, round of applause for Sarah, the Labour candidate. Jonathan Davies, Liberal Dem candidate as well. And what's becoming a habit these days at hustings that men seems to be involved in, and that's the Green candidates as well. So here's the plan. In a second, once I've quickly read just a little bit about the bio of each candidate off their site and off local press and so on, is to give each candidate 60 seconds to put their pitch forwards as to why they should be your next MP. Once they've done that, we're going to move straight into a number of questions which have just been provided today that yourselves have put together as a local community. There's a whole host of stuff to do with, I think, hospitals, schools, halal meat, and many, many other things as well. If you try and keep your questions brief, and we'll try and get the panelists to first respond to them, and then with each question, we'll try and get audience feedback as well, pretty much like question time format. Does that sound like a plan? Yeah. It's the only plan we've got. All right, so we will start first with our gentleman on the right, not necessarily politically, he can tell us whether or not that's the case, but nonetheless it's Mike. But it is interesting, isn't it? You've got the Tories, Labour, Lib Dem and the Greens, but I promise you I didn't design the seating like this. Quick bit of background on Mike. Former leader of Barnet Council, I'm told, stood in Harrow West in 2005, is that right? Didn't get elected on that occasion, but certainly did in 2010 for the current constituency. The public whip tells us his voting record is 85.8%, which is really, really good. It's a very, very good voting record. You might not agree with all of the votes, but the mere fact that he is there, you might agree with some, you might not agree with the others, but the mere fact that he's voting certainly shows he's not the kind of MP who doesn't turn up, is the point. In autumn 2013, Mike was appointed Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Right Honourable Eric Pickles, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. He was appointed PPS to Nick Bowles later. Mike resigned his position in order to vote in the 2014 backbench motion on Palestinian statehood. Mike opposed the motion on Palestinian statehood and said he was appalled the motion was passed by MPs. Mike's a member of the Conservative Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Cyprus and Conservative Friends of India. Also the chairman for the party's Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Advisory Board. Okay. Oh, sorry, one more thing. In 2008, he was the leader of Barnet Council. The Jewish Chronicle puts him in the in its Power 100 list for shaping Jewish life. All right, so that's Mike. So let's move on to Sarah. Sarah studied history at Cambridge and completed a master's at Harvard Law School. Works as a barrister in specialising in public planning and environmental law, representing individuals, NGOs, and public bodies. She teaches a course on urban politics and law at the LSE, and for many years has volunteered at Toynbee Hall, giving free legal advice and support to vulnerable Londoners. She says she is from a strongly Jewish family, a Zionist family. Does that sound about right? Anything you'd like to add to the bio?
We can talk about it.
We can talk about it.
That pretty much covers it.
Pretty much covers it, right? Okay, so now we move to our Lib Dem candidate, Jonathan Davies. Councillor in the Childs Hill Ward, is that how you pronounce it? Yep. Childs Hill Ward, in the 1990s, yeah. Stood as a PPC in Finchley and Golders Green in the 97 election, won 5,670 votes, finishing third in the constituency in that year. Former National Vice President of Liberal Democrats and Vice Chair of the Lib Dem Friends of Israel, and Treasurer at the Golders Green Synagogue. Is there just one synagogue in Golders Green? Or is there the main one? Sorry, Golders, I apologise. My team hasn't given me correct notes. Golders Green United Synagogue, that is, yeah? And then we have Adele Ward from the Green Party, who owns a local company Wardwood Publishing. Is that right? Wardwood Publishing. An author and an academic. Has lived in the area or nearby. I'm not quite sure what that means, yeah? But nonetheless, has lived in the area or nearby since 1979 and bought her 2 sons up there. Brilliant. So round of applause for everybody if that's all right. So let's start, as I say, 60 seconds for each panellist with Mike, we might as well on the right, to tell you why he should be your next MP.
Thank you. And also correct the organisations. I'm also a member of the Conservative Middle East Council. But the reason I'm standing for re-election is because I think I've got a strong track record, not only being local and living locally. Many of you will have known that I bring my advice surgeries here into the mosque on a regular basis to ensure that the community's voice is heard, even if we don't always agree on every topic. I've been involved here with the community since about 1992, when the mosque first sought planning permission for this building, and obviously recent planning permissions too. In terms of my record here is about helping people on local issues. The surgeries are about jobs and housing and immigration, bread and butter issues facing the local community. I am a member of the old party group, both on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. To me, they are the 2 sides of the same coin, and I abhor and oppose all forms of discrimination in whatever shape it takes. And my job is to ensure that not only is your voice heard, but also that we address some of the underlying causes of Islamophobia. And that's been my commitment locally over the past 5 years, and that's my commitment going forward if I'm re-elected for the next 5 years. That's it. It's my minute.
Thank you very much. Pretty much in a minute. Sarah.
Well, it's wonderful to be back here at the North Finchley Mosque. I've had the good fortune to visit here a couple of times. I grew up in a community a bit like yours, where people were used to taking time out from their day to pray, where people are careful about the food that they consume, separating permitted foods from non-permitted foods, and also from a community which is as interested in the affairs that go on in other parts of the world as they are on the affairs of our own community. And I grew up here in Finchley and Golders Green, where the values that I grew up with of diversity and tolerance, of the mixed community in which we live, those very values have informed my politics and my decision to stand for the Labour Party, a party committed to social justice, fairness and greater equality. And the fact is that the issues affecting the Muslim community are those that affect non-Muslims as well. Whether it's the struggle to get onto the housing ladder and get affordable rent, whether it's accessing NHS services in your local GP, whether it's the support that our public services need from libraries, parks, social care for the elderly. Those are issues that affect us whether we're Muslim or non-Muslim alike, and it's on those issues that I remain committed and that I will focus on if I'm elected as your MP.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Davis. Firstly, Mike didn't say anything about the coalition government, but I'm proud, as part of the coalition government, to be defending its record in particular on improving the economy, and also doing that in a way that is fair for all, that's delivered tax cuts for low and middle income families, not just for millionaires. And the more votes the Liberal Democrats achieve in this election, the more we will be able to deliver in the next Parliament, in particular, to carry on delivering tax cuts for low and middle income families, to deliver a stronger economy, but also a fairer society for everyone, taking a strong stance protecting the Human Rights Act, taking a strong stance against discrimination of all types, religious and racial. As Chairman said, I come from a Jewish background. And one thing that I'm very conscious of, and that I say very frequently in Jewish communal organisations, is how much in common people of all faiths, particularly Jewish and Muslim communities, have in the community.
Thank you very much.
Yes, to explain that, I've lived most of my adult life in Finchley and Golders Green, with a few years in Italy, which were very nice. And with a few in Maida Vale, but mostly in Finchley and Golders Green. And yes, I'm an author, journalist, publisher, academic doing the PhD. Hope to be working at the Royal Holloway teaching next year, but I'd much rather you elected me, in which case I will drop a lot of that work and do that. Bringing my children up here, living here since I was a student, starting my career here, I really know this area inside out. I know all of your issues, especially because I worked for 4 years in Garden Suburb Primary School in the playground, part-time, because they needed someone there. I got to know the children there. I got to know a lot of Muslim children. I still know them. They're between the ages of 17 and 19, like my children now. And I can recognise a lot of the issues you're talking about in the Muslim Manifesto, the needs of those children in school, any kind of racism or prejudice that comes out. But also now our policies resolve many of these issues, not just because we fight discrimination, but we're very egalitarian, but also we're committed to the obligation to provide apprenticeship for teenagers leaving school so they get the jobs you're asking for. We're committed to build genuinely affordable social housing and regulate and licence landlords so children can afford to live near their family and the environment, which I should really much more.
Right, so let's crack on then in that case. So I believe our first question is on a lack of housing, possibly social housing in Barnet. Who's asking this question? Yeah, if you'd like to mention your name, please.
My name is Esma Garnawi. I live in Sweetway, and I'm here to ask these people how they can help the Sweetway residents, because we ask for MP, we ask for the Cornelians, I don't know, head of councillor. They didn't even bother to help us. They didn't do anything to us, and we don't trust anyone.
Okay, so your question is...
And they make all the residents suffering. Till now, we still suffering. They give us, they throw us everywhere, like they put us far away from schools, from work. I'm a hard worker, and even they don't care.
Thank you very much. So I think we got the question. Mike, do you want to kickstart this then?
Well, actually, the issue on regeneration is difficult. If you want to build more homes, if you want to regenerate the estates, sometimes actually that estate is, I think, an MOD, Ministry of Defence estate. That means that those estates have to be demolished and rebuilt. If you want to build new homes of a high standard, with more homes on the site...
But they,
Sorry, excuse me.
Okay.
Please let him speak.
All right.
Thanks.
It's actually outside of the constituency, but I know enough about it to be able to understand on regeneration. You cannot argue that we want more housing unless we regenerate our estates, where we increase the utilisation of the land on our estates. And that does mean that housing has to be demolished and rebuilt. But secure tenants, is my understanding, will be rehomed in brand new properties. And that is the plan. But you cannot deal with the social housing crisis without building more homes. You can't oppose every regeneration scheme and then say we want more homes. It goes hand in hand.
Brilliant. All right, Sarah, what's your answer?
Thank you very much for your question about Sweetsway. Sweetsway, although it's outside the constituency, is symptomatic of the crisis facing Londoners in housing across the board. And it's all very well for Mike to refer to the need for regeneration and the building of more homes. But that's no good if the homes are unaffordable and out of the reach of ordinary Londoners. And we're seeing that right across the constituency in regeneration programmes such as at Brent Cross, Cricklewood. Only 15% of the housing proposed there is designed to be affordable, and even then, that's at 80% of market rent. If Labour gets elected, we are genuinely committed to delivering more affordable housing. If you want to understand the difference between a Labour approach and a Conservative approach, look at the social housing and the affordable housing being built by Labour councils, such as Camden and Islington, and compare it to Barnet. And one final point, it's not just about home ownership, it's also about affordable rent. Labour will deliver a better deal for renters by capping rents and creating more secure tenancies.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to go to Jonathan and then Adele. If you have a question on this, if you can just put your hands up and keep them up, if that's okay. Certainly towards the point at which Adele is ending, and we'll try and take all the questions in one round together from you, get the panellists to respond, and then go to the next question. Right, Jonathan?
I fear that what Sarah has just spoken about and what her cabinet colleagues have been speaking about today of capping rents, and also the Tory idea of right to buy, will both reduce the amount of affordable will reduce the availability of rented housing and affordable housing. Ultimately, the only way we will get more affordable housing in this country is by building more houses. But that has to be done where it is wanted by the local community. There are large parts, including areas surrounding London, where garden cities will be welcomed by the local community, and where we can build the additional housing this country and this city needs without imposing overdevelopment on local people.
Thank you very much. I'm so impressed the panellists are keeping their responses to the point and precise. It's going to help us getting through the questions. Adele.
I'm really glad there's someone here from Sweets Way, because you may remember I came and protested with you on that day. I was really disappointed not to see any Labour candidates there, and they really needed a lawyer, and I was very disappointed that Sarah's a lawyer in our constituency in the court didn't go and help the people. That really could have helped.
We didn't get any help from no one.
From nobody from the council either. So I want to say that first of all, and I will keep campaigning with all of you, whatever happens on May the 7th. We need more social housing, we need more affordable housing, we need to stop demolishing and moving families. Mike says that the massive demolition that's going on of council estates around this area, I've been shocked by it. He says secure tenants were allowed to stay. Insecure tenants had been living in these places for 16 years or more. Their children only know those as their homes. They're being moved from their schools during GCSEs, so that's really not a good answer. Compulsory purchase orders were served on people as old as 82 who were moved from homes that they thought they'd live their lives out in, not just in Sweets Way, but in the West Hendon estate, Whitefields estate, just across from Brent Cross, just for greed and commercial.
Okay, thank you very much.
And
So now, if we
it's been
can...
in The Guardian, the callousness of Tory Council moving the poor out of Barnet.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's get some questions from the audience then in that case. So gentlemen on the right, if we make them questions rather than speeches, please.
Question to Mike and perhaps to Sarah. As we understand, the regeneration would be 80% of it would be carried out by private enterprise, and the council would have only 20%. And how can they assure the local residents that the rent would be equitable in this case, because it's basically outside of the hands of the council?
Okay, we'll take 2, 3 together. Yes, gentlemen there.
I'd like to ask Sarah, our prospective MP, how she'll be able to actually approach this issue as this council is a Tory-run council. As an MP, how would she be able to actually...
What challenges will she face as a local Labour MP with the Tory council?
To do?
Yeah, okay, we'll let that one pass. Let's try and keep on relevant to the question, but nonetheless, yeah.
Yes, concerning Sweets Way, the big question was the way it's been handled. I mean, the way people were, moved around. I was given a property in Luton. I moved to Luton, and some of them moved to Porter's Bar and somebody beyond. So the way it's been handled, that's the main question about Sweets Way.
The way the whole, yes, the whole south has been handled. All right, Mike.
The issue on the regeneration schemes is basically that the deliverance of whether it's shared ownership or for rent is delivered through housing association partners. The Brent Cross Cricklewood regeneration scheme is funded privately. There's very little public money into it, which is why there may be less social housing in the scheme as other schemes. But the delivery of social housing is done through housing associations with nomination rights through Barnet Homes and Barnet Council's housing list. That's how Barnet controls the nomination, so that those people who live in Barnet get priority, or connections with Barnet get priority in accordance with the housing policy. But it's delivered through partners such as might be Catalyst or any of the other big housing associations, and that's how Barnet keeps the nomination rights. But the reason why you don't necessarily see the percentage that you might want to see is because Brent Cross Cricklewood is largely being developed by private money and not by public money.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, do you want to answer the gentleman's question about a Tory-run council and a local Labour MP?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, these questions I think tend to tie together. At the moment, we have a Conservative-run council, a Conservative council that's built 3 council properties in the last 20 years. We have 3 Conservative MPs at present in Barnet, and we have a Conservative-led central government. So where is the accountability in that? Where are the elected representatives to put the counter argument? The fact is, in this part of North London, it is one-way traffic in terms of policy making, because for understandable reasons, Mike is unlikely to critique the actions of a council. And so, time and time again, the same sections of the community lose out because the political will at every layer of government is all focused on certain sections of society. That's one of the best arguments that I can think of for electing an MP from a different party to put forward a different perspective.
Okay.
And that different perspective, I think, touches on your question, sir, because what we've seen, not just in Barnet, but in the country as a whole, over the last 40 years, is a complete collapse in local authority house building. That's why there's a crisis in housing, because there is a lack of supply. And the reason there is so little affordable housing, I'm afraid, is a question of political will. Because even if the developer is a private one, it is up to the council, which issues the planning permission, to demand
Thank you very much, Sarah.
housing.
Thank you very much. Right, Jonathan, do you want to say something on this? And
Just want to say a word on the gentleman's question about it's not the percentage of who's building them what matters, it's the percentage of affordable housing. And on that, I'm afraid both Barnet Council and the Mayor of London have a very bad record in insisting on a significant proportion of affordable housing in development. So we see blocks of flats going up for sale in the millions without adequate provision being made for affordable housing.
Thank you very much. Adele?
Yes, I mean, it's really important to be building social housing. The Greens have committed to building 500,000 new homes. It's a good investment for the future. It's paid for by the rents that come from social housing. I would just also like to say that when I was at Sweets Way protesting, there were people from Labour-run councils who also came and were complaining about Labour-run council doing this as well. So if Sarah is genuinely criticising this, I would like a real commitment from Sarah that the Brent Cross development and what the effect on the local council estates will be turned down again, as it was by the Labour government before her and was voted in by Mike Freer, and as you can hear, being passed to private developers with a tiny percentage of social housing, which in the small print they don't actually even have to build.
Okay, that's fine. Right, well, let's move on to the next question, which is to do with car theft in the locality and insurance premiums. Who's asking this question?
Me.
Yes. Sorry, your name first, please.
Mona Arifin. Theft in Barnet is amongst the highest, and also general theft. And we would like to know that that means that our car insurance premiums are higher than the national average. And in general, the theft is also quite high. So what would be your strategy to address and fund this issue?
Okay. Jonathan, do you want to go first?
I feel, in terms of, there's another issue other than theft on insurance premiums, which I'll come back to in a moment. In terms of theft, we clearly need a strong, active police force working with the local community, being accessible to the local community, and being visible out on the streets. I'm very upset that what we've got at the moment is police shops in a number of our high streets that are open an hour or two a week at most, which is a total waste of time. Either they should not spend the money on the real estate, or they should have them open and accessible to the public. We want police force working with the local community. Just a word for the moment on car insurance. The other reason why car insurance has gone up is because of claimant fraud on third-party liability claims, on which the Ministry of Justice, with us working with, has been taking some action.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike?
The key issue, actually, there's a very long answer about how Compare the Market actually compare their data, because I had long conversations with them how they publish their figure. It's not strictly accurate. But the key issue about crime is about one of the reasons why you've seen things like Temple Fortune Police Station closing is because bricks and mortar don't catch criminals, and putting police on the street does, and that's why we've got 54 more police officers on the street. But the other thing that's been introduced recently is called automatic number plate recognition, because most of the crime is done by a small number of people that the police know about. And ANPRs, it's called, as they enter the borough, it flashes up to the police on the street, and they know what to look for. There is no magic solution. You can have a police officer on every street corner, and it wouldn't necessarily cause a reduction in the car crime. It's about dealing with the hardcore criminals that are responsible, and ANPR is one of those key measures being introduced.
Okay, thank you very much. And yourself, Adele?
Yes, I'm extremely worried about crime. Crime is up in the area, despite them saying crime figures are down. Violent crime and burglary are up. The serious crimes are up by about 30%. And I heard Andrew Dismore at Ever Hastings, he's a lawyer, he said successful prosecutions are tiny, about a third. I've seen myself, we've seen more crime in the streets, and I think people don't report crimes as much. People need to be encouraged to report crimes, but it is very worrying that under this government, serious crimes like burglary and attacks on women, and you're hearing that with cars, have gone up, and we would commit more to the police.
Thank you very much. Right. Sorry, Sarah.
That's okay. No, that's fine. That's okay. Don't worry. Have you experienced car theft yourself?
No, but my neighbours have,
Yeah.
and in general, my next door neighbour has. It was just a few months ago, but I have to admit the police were very quick. I do admit that.
Good.
I didn't actually expect them to be there, but they came very quickly for the house theft.
No, because one of the things that I did when I became the candidate was I wrote to the borough commander and I asked to go out on the patrol with a couple of the police officers to see what their job was like, to see what are the challenges that they're facing. Whilst I was in the car, apart from the thrill of putting on the blue light in response to a theft, which we were attending to, I spoke with them in a very candid way and to try and understand the pressures that police are under. And as you know, the nearest police station to here is in Colindale. But what these officers told me is that they are under a huge amount of pressure because of the cuts to neighbourhood policing. They feel that they are fighting fires, which is what you're reporting and what your neighbours are experiencing as well. And in order to do more of that frontline neighbourhood policing, we need to put more resources into that. And that's precisely why Labour is going to take steps, for example, such as cutting police and crime commissioners and putting that additional money into frontline policing.
Thank you very much. Right, let's move on. There's so many more questions to get through. We've now got a question on Islamophobia and the media. Who's asking that one?
Mine was about Islam in the media rather than Islamophobia.
I have a question here with the increase of Islamophobia and the negative portrayal of Muslims in the media. Will somebody fund the and funding to do with local mosque and security? Is that the question? All right, it's been supplied by the mosque anyway, so I'll read it out in that event, and you can come in with your point on the question, sir, if that's all right. So the question I've been given here goes as follows. With the increase of Islamophobia and the portrayal of Muslims in the media in general, negative portrayal presumably, we as a community are feeling more and more under threat. Would you campaign or support additional funding for security of the mosque as per funding received by other groups? So presumably what's behind this question is the Community Security Trust receives government funding to protect synagogues, or at least to provide protection for synagogues. Mosques currently don't in any form. Will the candidates support a fund of such a description being created? If I can ask the candidates just to include in their response the following two as well, which is from the Then Muslim Manifesto, and that is, would they support a separate recording of Islamophobia as a separate category of crime? So currently many police forces record racism as a separate category of crime, anti-Semitism as well. Would they support Islamophobia being recorded by the police? And also, what is their view on putting through the Lord Levison's recommendations on the media and its reporting on British Muslims and seeing them through to a proper regulator? Shall we go with Mike first?
Okay. One of the things I often found difficult is why, when we read the newspaper, they have to describe someone by their religion. And it doesn't matter whether someone is described as a Muslim or a Catholic or a Jewish businessman. It doesn't matter. We should ensure that the media stop using someone's religion as a way of singling them out and this kind of guilt by association, whichever the religion is.
How?
And it should simply, well, we can set...
Sorry,
we can,
perhaps in Jesus.
and so it's something that I've argued for before. And I have to say that hate crime, whatever the hate crime, should be recorded accurately. Whether that is, it doesn't really matter whether it is because you're Jewish or Muslim or whatever it is. The police should record it accurately, and a hate crime is in the eye of the person reporting it, not the police recording
What
it.
do you mean when you say accurately? Sorry, just for the
If I-
audience's benefit,
well-
like based on whether it's Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, or racist? Is that what you mean when you say accurately?
If the person reporting it believes it's an Islamophobic attack, it's an Islamophobic
So the
attack.
police should record it
And the police should
accordingly.
record it
Sorry.
appropriately.
Okay. Yes.
In terms of security, one of the first things I was involved in 2010 was the creation of the 2.3 million fund for security at faith schools. And in fact, the rules were quite specific. at the initial fund was any school that was a faith school that was at risk would be have its security funded. It wasn't for a particular community. It was any faith school where there was a proven risk. And so I have no problem in signing up for that. And in fact, my track record locally is any time there is tension in communities locally, you will find I've been in contact with the management committee to ensure that the police are here providing support for the local mosque.
Okay, so that's fine. So just before we go to Sarah, Mike, are you okay clarifying two things, please? The first one is Theresa May did publicly say, as part of the recent wave of counter-terrorism kind of proposals the Tories published, she did say Islamophobia would be recorded as a separate category of crime under a future Tory government, but then the Tory manifesto, for some reason, didn't include it. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on why that was the case and it wasn't included. Secondly, on security, I guess the question was more so, the Community Security Trust does receive several millions of pounds a year, specifically to protect security at synagogues. If the Muslim Council of Britain or any other body, for argument's sake, was requesting the same funding from government to protect mosques, would you support that? That's the question.
Yes, the bottom line, if I take it backwards, the bottom line is any mosque or community building that has a proven risk of attack should be protected using government money. And I don't care what the religion is, if there is a risk of attack, it should be protected. And that's the bottom line. In terms of the manifesto, if Theresa May has said it should be reported, that's her view. The manifesto, unfortunately, all of us are guilty of it as politicians, the manifestos tend to become a little bland and are not a full shopping list. So if Theresa May has said it, then I have no doubt that she would deliver it if she's still the Home Secretary.
So by extension, very quickly, would you only support other places of worship which are at risk from attack receiving funding as well? So if there were Hindu places of worship which weren't at risk from attack, you wouldn't support them. There were Jewish places of worship which weren't at risk from attack, you wouldn't support them either.
The security funding has to be based on police intelligence. If they believe a building is at risk of attack, whether it's a mosque or a synagogue or a Hindu temple or a school, then the funding should be there.
Okay.
But it has to be risk-driven.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you. I want to say a word about addressing the underlying causes of Islamophobia, because I think all of us have a responsibility to use language appropriately. When people say that tackling anti-Semitism is the role of the Jewish community, I say that they're wrong. When they say that addressing the cause of Islamophobia is the responsibility of the Muslim community, I say that they're wrong. The fact is, an attack, whether it's on any minority, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or people of no faith, at the end of the day, that's the responsibility of all of us. And I think that politicians have a particular responsibility to use language which is appropriate and to call out Islamophobia when we hear it. And the same is true of our media. It's quite right that we should call out and properly regulate those who use and deploy language which is inflammatory and which singles out the Muslim community in a way which is and which strays into Islamophobia. And that leads me to the specific question that you asked, which is, should Islamophobia and Islamophobic attacks be recorded as a separate category in the same way that anti-Semitic attacks are? I believe they should. Many police forces in the country are already doing this, and I think that it's right, because otherwise we cannot quite understand the nature of the problem and the scale of it. I think there's also something to be said when we talk about how we address the underlying causes for the cooperation which I'm aware is taking place between Tel Mama, which monitors Islamophobic attacks, and the Community Security Trust, which does an equivalent job for the Jewish community. That example of cooperation, of mutual cooperation and interfaith dialogue between different communities is precisely how we're going to go about addressing the underlying causes of this hate. The other thing, of course, is that politicians have a responsibility to think very carefully about not meddling in foreign policy problems, which we may get onto later, because that too can stoke animosity between different groups. But yes, we need to be careful about our language. All of us have a responsibility, not just politicians, by the way, in our schools, in our daily lives, in our interaction with our neighbours, to call out hatred and hate crime wherever we go.
So Sarah, do you want to just very quickly answer two quick questions? If you have your hands up, please, if you've got questions. One is, if the Lord Leveson recommendations don't see the light of day for whatever reason, would Labour back a statutory approach to media regulation? And secondly, same question as was asked to Mike Freer, and that is, would you support a pot of funding to provide security to mosques the way there already is to synagogues?
Well, what I would say is that the Lord Leveson inquiry, which was triggered by the phone hacking scandal and the Millie Dowler scandal, was triggered not least because of the intervention of Ed Miliband, who stood up to Rupert Murdoch and the activities of his papers. So the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry are something which the Labour Party takes very seriously and which we want to see implemented, and that obviously will have ramifications for what we've just been talking about here. With regard to funding for security...
But the question on statutory intervention, the question was, would you support statutory intervention from a regulatory perspective then? Or would you not go that far?
I think we've got to be really, really careful with how we handle this, because on the one hand, we want freedom of expression, we want to protect freedom of the press, and we have to ask ourselves and interrogate, and I say this as a public lawyer as well, whether legislation actually helps the problem. I don't rule it out, but I don't say that statutory regulation is the answer to everything, nor will it, in my view, address the underlying problem, which is the cause of the Islamophobic speech or the hate speech in the first instance. And I say the same thing about the security funding for religious buildings of any kind. Like Mike, I agree, where there's a proven risk, the state has a responsibility to protect its citizens, and that money should be made available. But I do think that we serve our communities best if we put our efforts into tackling the underlying causes rather than creating fortresses of all our communities.
Thank you very much. Jonathan.
One of the most unfortunate things about this general election, and I don't think it's for any of the four of us on this panel, is that there has been in this general election a large degree of anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant sentiment. I think that is despicable. I think that is very unfortunate that has characterised the election. I was very pleased to see in this document that you've just given me a commitment to attacking Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And in the equivalent document published by the Board of Deputies of British Jews, there is a commitment to attacking anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because they and all forms of hate crime, and particularly anti-religious hate crime, are opposite sides of the same coin, by people who think that being unwelcoming and attacking people who are different from the mainstream is a solution to this country's problems. Going on to the specific questions, colleagues of mine in Hackney Council have been promoting the Community Security Trust and Shonrim working together to protect local mosques. I, every couple of weeks, spend part of my Saturday morning standing outside my synagogue as part of the Community Security Trust patrol, because the primary responsibility for protecting synagogues lies with the members of those synagogues, and actually government funding for synagogues as opposed to schools was a very recent announcement, and I hope when the detail of that is worked out, it will indeed cover all places of worship that are under attack, because any building that is a threat of attack, it is a public responsibility to prevent crime.
Okay, thank you very much. Adele? If you have your hands up, please, if you've got questions.
Yes, I'm glad that Jonathan raised the issue of the discrimination we've been hearing in a lot of our hustings, and I have drawn the attention of the press to that. I will call and root out discrimination anytime I hear it. There's some easy answers here. Do I believe mosques should be funded in an equal way to Jewish buildings? Yes. Do I support recording of Islamophobia as a separate crime? Yes. And it should be equal to other crimes of prejudice. We're very egalitarian on those. Proper regulation of the press. I come from a journalistic background, so I believe very fiercely in freedom of speech, but what I'm seeing is a totally different to freedom of speech at the moment, so I would agree to more legislation being used on this, even as a journalist. Because I think what we're seeing at the moment, there's a problem with the ownership of much of our press by a few billionaires who are pushing their own agenda, and I think it does actually get to the point of instilling fear and instilling hatred, and when it does that, I think legislation should be used against it. But what I would prefer is to see us not need the security. I moved to Golders Green because it's such a safe area. It's quite an oasis of safety, despite us being such a multinational area. And I hope we can all work on keeping it that kind of peaceful area and not feel we have to barricade ourselves.
All right, so take a few questions together. This gentleman on the left first, and then the lady at the back, and then we'll come here. Yeah.
So I'd like to thank the panel for their answers, but it goes beyond, with respect to media, it goes beyond inaccurate or wrong stories. I think as Mike Fair alluded to, the constant hammering of emphasising people being Muslims if they commit a crime or do something wrong, whereas when Muslims do something good, the fact that they're Muslim is never mentioned. And I would like to ask what can an MP, or generally what can Parliament do about that?
Okay, we'll take the ladies at the back as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Sabina Imran. Actually, I came here, I didn't put up any questions.
Sorry, just a bit louder, please.
I'm Dr. Sabina Imran. I came to listen to your views. I did not put up any question, but the questions are coming up in my mind. I thought maybe they were.
Go for it. Go.
Actually, my question was more about closing down the libraries in this borough and some of them privatizing. That was my main question I wanted to ask or know. What is the stance of Labour on it? Because we know that the Conservatives are doing that. And also, but my question, which is coming up in my mind, just regarding this Islamophobia, that there is also a prevent policy being probably going to be introduced in the nurseries, which I, as a doctor, believe that it is not, it is an absurd idea. And how would you then determine whether there is some terrorist sort of a mind or a bullying? Because bullying is already so much prevalent in the schools that still it has not been controlled. And the teachers still are trying to do that. How are they going to explain about that?
Okay, that's fine. So your prevent point, we're going to leave it for later when we get to the counter-terrorism section, if that's all right. Not to worry at all. The library point, the candidates will address in a second. And we'll take the gentleman with the kind of checked shirt, and then we'll get the candidates to give his answers.
Hi, my name is Shahzad. Thank you very much, Sarah, regarding addressing the underlying causes rather than tackling the symptoms. So talking about the underlying causes, would you support measures to prevent, just as they prevented radical Muslim preachers to traveling to UK, which rightly so, to agree, would you support similar measures to prevent radical ultra-Orthodox Zionist rabbis, or radical evangelical Christians from certain parts of US, or radical certain European politicians, as we know in Denmark or in Holland, from traveling to UK to make speeches, to attend conferences, or would you defend them by saying, oh, they have freedom of speech?
All right, we'll let that pass. That one pass in this. All right, let's start this time maybe with the Greens. So 3 points then, to be clear, about Muslims being mentioned unnecessarily in the media, libraries being shut down, and radical preachers from abroad coming to the UK being banned from various backgrounds.
Okay, I think I covered how I feel about the media, and I do take that very seriously. We do need to call that out. We do need legislation, I believe, to deal with that. With the libraries, I've protested very strongly on behalf of the libraries, but the problem is there isn't the funding coming from central government to councils. And we've seen in all councils, not just Barnet Council, which gets a bad press, but deservedly, but also Brent Council, which is Labour, has closed libraries. So I would like to hear from the Labour candidate how they're going to get the funding, rather than just standing up for the libraries. How's that funding going to go? There's been a decrease in council tax, which is what funds our local services, and the Greens would restore that council tax so that these kind of services would be funded. Libraries are important. Labour wants a mansion tax instead, which keeps the money centrally. I know they said for the NHS, which can be funded other ways, but how, if they're not doing it with council tax, can those libraries be funded? Radical preachers coming to here. This is where freedom of speech reaches a certain point. I think it just depends how dangerous a person is, what they've been preaching, if there are actually crimes of violence that are led to by that person. So there is a line that's drawn somewhere. It's a sliding scale, rather than we would ban all of them.
Sorry, so to be clear, what you're saying is people are allowed to have different views, but when they espouse violence, that's where you draw the line.
When they're actually inciting hatred, instilling fear, leading to people committing crimes, that's where it becomes different.
Well, there's a line between inciting hatred and inciting violence, isn't there? Are you saying
yes, inciting violence?
Okay, violence is where you draw that.
Inciting something that's an actual crime, rather than criminalise what people think.
Absolutely fine. Okay, Jonathan.
I think on the last gentleman's question, that was the subject of what I think is politely described as a full and frank exchange of views in Cabinet between Theresa May on one side and Nick Clegg on the other. And Nick Clegg's view, which I support, which actually is pretty much the view that Adele has just expressed, is that the line is drawn between people who are inciting crime, kill the Jews, which is clearly inciting murder, and people who are merely expressing a view, however much we may however much other people may despise it or be offended by it. And that is where I think the line is drawn. And that is where actually the line is adequately drawn by current law, which makes incitement to murder, incitement to other serious criminal offences already a criminal offence, which is why the Liberal Democrats in government took the view that no further criminal offences were needed. On the question of libraries, it's a campaign that my colleague, the candidate in Hendon, has been taking a very leading role on. We said this time last year at the time of the council elections that the Conservatives pushed through a political gimmick, a 21 pence a week cut in council tax. That would lead to serious and disastrous cuts in serious attacks on public services. Interestingly, the Labour councillors in the council didn't oppose that tax cut. And what happened? Lo and behold, we've seen proposals to close the libraries in East Finchley and Childs Hill and seriously reduce the ability of other libraries by reducing their size to act as community hubs. And we have said very strongly those proposals should be sent straight back to the drawing board.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah.
Let me take the questions backwards. I think it's a really great question. We have a fantastic piece of legislation in this country, and it's called the Human Rights Act. And it's a very powerful piece of legislation which protects freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and the right to life. Indeed, it's been used time and time again to strike down draconian laws, not least at the moment tackling the use of Schedule 7, stop and search, which I know disproportionately affects Muslims in our airports. And so in relation to your question, I think we've got the right legislative mix, and it's the courts, the independent judiciary, that are the arbitrators of that fine line between freedom of expression, which includes the freedom to express views with which many of us in this room would disagree, and the hate crime that others have referred to. Because the freedom of expression is not an absolute freedom. It's a qualified freedom. And it's qualified by those who overstep the mark and offend public morals and threaten national security. And I think that's where we need to draw the line. And what we must get away from is a double standard, which singles out particular hate preachers, if you like, from certain groups, but doesn't enforce against others. But we have the right legislation, it's just a question of enforcing it. And by the way, it's worth noting that the Conservative Party, if they're elected, are planning to scrap the Human Rights Act. And I think that would be a big step backwards. With respect to libraries, I got involved in local politics as part of a campaign, a successful campaign, I'm happy to add, to save Fry and Barnet Library. I was the lawyer there who helped represent local residents. And I've stood shoulder to shoulder with the 10,000 residents right across Barnet who've signed petitions to save our public libraries because we recognise their value to the public and as community hubs. Yes, money is tight, but I also believe the money can be found, whether from development contributions, through Section 106 agreements, as we're seeing coming through the new regeneration schemes, or through other pots of money. But the starting point that we begin with is different from the Conservatives. It is how can we maintain these public spaces for public use, how can we innovate, modernise and use them, rather than how can we shut them down and sell them off. And finally, with regard to your question, you're absolutely right. No one said when Anders Breivik perpetrated one of the biggest terrorist attacks that Europe has seen for many a year, that was somehow because of Christian values or because of white values. And so similarly, it comes back to this question of how do we use language in a responsible way. What can an MP do? I think they can start by leading by example in the way they talk about these sensitive issues, by engaging and encouraging interfaith cooperation, and also by, I think, within our schools, encouraging teachers to be vigilant. You know, I was here not that long ago, and someone told me, one of the members of the congregation, a very short story, something that really hit home with me, which is that their son had come home from school, and instead of playing cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians, his son was reporting that in their school they were playing terrorists and good guys, and the Muslim kids were always playing the terrorists. Now that shocked me deeply. So it's a responsibility for all of us, not just politicians, parents, school teachers, neighbours alike, to tackle the underlying causes of this.
Thank you very much. Mike?
If I could just cover the two kind of separate things. what can MPs do? The first thing we do is ensure that these issues are constantly raised in Parliament, constantly raised with the Culture Secretary, constantly raised with the complaints process with the media, so that they know they can no longer get away with it. The second thing is, as Sarah said, is leading by example. How many of us challenge casual racism of whatever form in conversation? When we're in a shop, if we hear people talking, if we're sat round the table eating and we hear people making inappropriate comments, how many times do we challenge them? It's uncomfortable challenging friends when they veer off thinking it's polite, or they just think they can get away with it. So we have to do that ourselves. It starts with us, not just from the government. But in terms of dealing with hate crime, I have and will continue to do. I don't care which religion they're from or who they are trying to speak for. I opposed the admission of Geert Wilders, the Dutch MP. I opposed the preacher from the Westboro Baptist Church, because I don't care what religion they are hiding behind or what political philosophy they are hiding behind. If they try to divide communities, then they are not welcome in the UK. Now, in terms of the libraries, we can't talk about fiscal responsibility and then pretend we can't change things. There was a letter left by the previous Labour government that said there is no money. But we also have to ensure that our libraries are up to speed at dealing with the modern world as it is. Because if you're dealing with Amazon, if you're dealing with Kindles, if you're dealing with the internet, then a building full of books doesn't attract new customers. And I've said on record there should be and will be no library closures. But you also have to engage those people who aren't using the libraries to find out why. Those who use the libraries love them, understandably, but any organisation that needs new customers has to find out why. And I give you an example of how a modern library service can be run, and that's the Idea Store in Tower Hamlets. Open, modern, and internet-based. And that's the way we need to modernise our library services if they're going to be fit for the future.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to go in a second. Sorry, we're going to go into a question on faith schools in just a second. I'm just going to ask, however, the panel for a simple yes or no answer, if that's okay, on pledge number 1, actually in the Muslim manifesto, which is being asked by Muslims all across the UK to their candidates, and that's quite simply this. Because a lot of the candidates spoke about double standards and we shouldn't operate double standards. But UK law does contain an extraordinary deficiency at the moment when it comes to protection of communities in terms of incitement to racial hatred versus incitement to religious hatred. For the audience's benefit, put simply, the law as it stands sets the threshold at a very fair level when prosecuting for incitement to racial hatred, in the sense that to insult, abuse or use violent or threatening words against somebody based on their race, which covers the black community, the Jewish community and the Sikh community under UK law, is likely to be incitement to racial hatred. But when you look at it from a religious perspective, which is largely what governs the Muslim community, it's perfectly fine to insult somebody based upon their religious identity, to use abusive words or behaviour. In fact, the law specifically contains an exemption even to the point of violent or threatening words or behaviour, unless they are used with an intention to stir up religious hatred. So in other words, the threshold is much higher and, as many people have commented, virtually unworkable, meaning since 2006 nobody has ever been prosecuted under the incitement to religious hatred. But to prosecute under racial hatred is very straightforward. So I guess the kind of simple yes or no answer, if we can get it from the panel, starting with Adele, is will you work to equalise that threshold? Meaning whatever it takes to prosecute against incitement on Sikhs, Jews and blacks is exactly the same in terms of prosecuting when it comes to Muslims.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
You'd agree with that, okay? Jonathan Davis.
I'm not sure this is capable of a one-word answer.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Take two.
Equalise, absolutely, yes. But the test has to be incitement to hatred or incitement to violence, not merely causing offence. I think everything all four of us have said on this platform has probably offended 3 people. That can't make something illegal.
Sure, but that wasn't the question. The question was the threshold which currently exists for black people, Sikh people and Jewish people. Are you happy for that burden of proof, as so to speak, that threshold to be applied to Muslim people?
Threshold must be the same. Absolutely.
Okay, that was the question. Okay, so 2 yeses, over to 7.
Yes.
Okay, and over to Mike.
Yes.
Fantastic. Right, so we shall move on. Is there any questions quickly on this gentleman there, very quickly?
Yes, forgive me for not standing up on disabled, so I'll be...
No worries at all.
I've got several questions to the panel. The first one is on the issue of foreign policy. We know that...
We're coming to foreign policy later. Do you have anything on the specific subject of Islamophobia and the media at the moment? But you can ask the foreign policy one when we come to that, that's all right.
Okay, on the Islamophobia issue, will the panel make sure that the rights of the Muslims are enshrined in law, so therefore to give them protection in the practice of their religions, such as halal meat and reading and the interpretations of the Quran? Because sometimes I know that some readers and some scholars were prevented from interpreting strictly the Quran because they might fall foul of the English law. So that's one of the points that I want to
Okay, so
ask.
let's hold off that. That's about to come shortly as well. Someone had a question on faith schools. Can that question be asked now, please? Yes, lady at the back.
I recently worked in a Islam school recently, and the Islam school I was working in was just a Islam school, and they didn't teach any gay sexual assault in school and sex education at age of young children. So, and then the government said that, you know, from now on they need to start teaching sexual assault in school. However, the parents disagree with that, and they don't want the children to be, you know, teaching to teach them at that age.
Okay.
Shouldn't the school have a right to say no if they don't want to teach that?
The national curriculum, effectively. Yeah. Okay. All right. Do you guys all get that question? Yeah. All right. So who wants to go first? Sarah, do you want to go first? Yeah. Basically, the question. Apologies. I should repeat the question. It was based around, I guess, what's a fundamental contradiction to a degree, in that if the schools have a certain view on issues like sex education at a young age. My wife asked me just a few days ago when a letter arrived at home about whether or not our son should be in a session about sex education. He's only 11 years old or whatever. Should the school have the right on whether or not that sort of stuff and stuff that's controversial should be taught, or should everyone just go with what the national curriculum or the kind of effectively what's been created at the governmental level? Should everyone just go with the national view on it, or should schools be given some kind of autonomy from a local level?
I think that if a school receives state funding, if it is a state school, then I think it ought to teach the national curriculum. And I think that the great major world faiths have always grappled with the interaction between orthodox religious doctrine and the practices of or the norms, the social norms of the country in which they live, and the liberal values of this country. And that's part of what makes Islam, Judaism, Christianity, these are great faiths which grapple with that. And I don't think that should be beyond those schools which receive state funding to grapple with some things which can be in tension, but which I think it's possible to teach Muslim values and the doctrine that defines your faith, and provide sex education, physical, social education, which in any event one's children is going to be encountering in the society in which we live. And I don't think the two things need to be mutually exclusive, but if you do get public money, I think it's important to follow the national curriculum on these things.
Okay.
It's the same actually, because the thing which is happening in my mind is that, yes, you're right that it should be, if it's a state funding, but what we feel is that the timing is too early, and in our religion it doesn't conform with our values if we go so early. So why cannot be it incorporated the way it should be conducive for the Muslims as well as with the going with that, because we feel that it is too early, because in Islam it is of course told what time is right to explain to them at puberty or just before that, but that we believe it is too early.
Fair enough. All right, Jonathan.
We do want to make the national curriculum more flexible for schools, down to a minimum core curriculum. But ultimately, we do believe that all children in all schools need to be taught to face the problems that are around them in the world, need to be taught to face the problems in the world that are around them as it is today.
Okay, Adol.
Yes, we do believe in the national curriculum for state-funded schools. However, I think you heard what actually happens, which our chair here said, which is what happened with my children, which is that parents have the right to say no. So every child's parent in your school could say no to it, but it does have to be offered at that age as part of the national curriculum, and it does get offered again just before puberty. So I think it's really the parents who have the right to say no.
Okay, Mike?
I think the premise that teaching about sex education at puberty is the right time is a valid point of view. But I think it's wrong to suggest that children below the age of puberty are not sexually aware. In the modern world, the access to images and information is out there, and I think we have to realise that whilst you might want a cut-off of awareness, it is often much younger than many parents would like. And therefore, if it is a state school or state-funded school, then the schools should have to ensure that their pupils are taught and prepared for what's going on around them. But the bottom line is it has to be age-sensitive in partnership with the parents. And if parents aren't willing or don't want it, they have the right to opt out. But my personal view is that we do need to ensure that our children are prepared and informed as to what they're going to have to deal with.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so let's move on to the next question, which is to do with religious attire.
Excuse me. Susan O'Callaghan, my question is, does the panel think that the central government has a right to legislate for ladies' attire?
Okay, so I'll just repeat that question for everyone's benefit. Does the panel think central government has the right to legislate for religious attire? So we're getting into the kind of whole human rights issue. Let's just add to this halal meat as well, Sharia courts as well. Let's just deal with all three at the same time. So halal meat, Sharia courts and religious attire. Shall we start with Sarah? Give you the least amount of preparation.
Absolutely.
Excuse me, I don't think it's going to do the justice to the question by bundling all three together because they have three different emphases.
Well, let's see how the candidates get along, and if you think they haven't addressed it, ask a question. Okay.
Lord Neuberger, who's the President of the Supreme Court, has said, judges have to show and have to be seen to show respect to everybody equally, and that requires an understanding of different cultural and social habits. It is absolutely necessary to have some understanding as to how people from different cultural, social and religious backgrounds think and behave and how they expect others to behave. And that was in an intervention specifically on the wearing of the veil in court. That is the President of the highest court in the land, someone for whom the rule of law and respect for individual human rights and religious feelings are at the core of what our judiciary seek to enforce. And I'm really pleased to see that our courts recognise the right to wear the veil in court. I don't think it's necessary, in a short answer, for central government to legislate on this, because I think that unlike many countries in mainland Europe, we have a good, legal, liberal tradition which permits in our public spaces and in all walks of life the wearing of whatever dress people wish to, including in the highest courts in the land, and I think that's just as it should be.
Well, are there any circumstances, Sarah, you'd support of a woman having to take her veil off? Any circumstances?
Is there?
Sorry, we'll come to the audience in a second, please. Thanks.
Plainly, if a woman or any individual feels comfortable to make adaptations to a particular situation, that's fine. If they feel uncomfortable, then, for example, it's very common in our courts for people to give secret evidence behind screens and what have you. There is no reason, in my view, why similar adaptations cannot be made to respect the modesty and the religious beliefs of that individual and still have, for example, a fair trial. And that's probably one of the most intense situations you can imagine.
Okay, meat and Sharia, please.
On the question of halal, in the same way as the Shechita laws in Judaism, Labour is absolutely clear. We will protect the religious freedoms of ritual slaughter, without which Muslims and Jews, and indeed other religions perhaps, cannot practice their faith. And we're absolutely clear about that, and I entirely agree with that position.
And Sharia courts, finally.
And in terms of Sharia courts, plainly for certain areas of one's social life, the Sharia courts have jurisdiction to which one might, as an individual, want to submit oneself to. And we have, again, a liberal democracy which permits that. But we also have civic obligations, civil and secular obligations, and we also have this very important principle, equality before the law. And so it's important that whilst you may wish as an individual to submit to Sharia courts, that we also enforce the laws of this country, which apply to everyone regardless of your faith.
So if I've understood you correctly, you're fine with Sharia courts as long as they don't contradict the law of the land.
That is right.
Okay, Mike, over to you.
On attire, I fully support individual liberty. And that means you will also be offended by what you see people wearing on the street. So I want you to have the freedom to wear what you want, but that means that other people have the freedom to wear what they want. And that's a open, liberal society of mutual tolerance. In terms of the court, which I think is one of the underlying issues, if you wanted me to address
Yeah,
that.
sorry, just on the niqab, do you think there's any circumstances in which a woman should be removing her niqab?
Where this comes into conflict is mainly in court, where there is this right of the accuser to see the defendant. And I think there are ways round it. Our system is pragmatic, and I think if judges work with the lawyers of the various people informed, it is able to protect the modesty of the individuals. There's a way round it. I don't think we need to legislate to say that everybody should be unveiled. There are ways, as Sarah said, about using screens or privacy so that people can verify without having to destroy someone's modesty.
Fair enough.
In terms of halal and shahita, before I started campaigning to protect this, I actually went to a kosher abattoir. I thought I'd better see it for myself. And I have to tell you, if you're the animal, there's no such thing as a good death. But I have seen both the bolt and I've seen the religious slaughter. And as far as I was concerned, the humanity and the compassion shown to the animal is paramount by those doing the killing. And from that point of view, and it's in our party manifesto, the religious slaughter is absolutely protected. And in terms of, I think the final point was Sharia. In terms of advising and looking after the community, I have no problem. But the rule of law remains paramount. If there's a conflict, the rule of UK law set by Parliament has to remain paramount.
So just very quickly on that, why did Theresa May order a review into Sharia courts and made it publicly clear there'd be no such review into Bethlehem courts? Was there a reason behind that?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask Theresa May. I have to say.
She was the Home Secretary at the time of your party.
Well, she is, but I have to say that Theresa doesn't phone me up on a daily basis to get my views on that kind of policy. I would have to go back and find out why she felt the need to. But it may well be part of reassurance. If there is a pressure, especially in the media, that Sharia courts are in some way outside of the law, then it is right for the Home Secretary to say, let's have a look at this to see how it can be dealt with, to make sure that we can reassure people that it is not in conflict, that it is not setting up one community as different from another. So it's not always a negative when the Home Secretary seeks a review.
Okay, Jonathan.
Take them, I think, in the order they came. So far as religious attire is concerned, I was deeply concerned and opposed by the French legislation on that question. I think the effect of the legislation in France and indeed in Turkey has been to exclude Muslim women from universities. And I think that is outrageous. The only possible grounds for legislation, if it is causing some harm real harm, as opposed to being offended, real harm to third parties, and I cannot see it. I'm proudly wearing the yarmulke, and I respect the right of other people to wear their religious attire. So far as halal is concerned, Mike, having visited an abattoir, I wonder if it's turned you into a vegetarian. There was an exchange of correspondence in the local press between myself and one of my fellow candidates, where we wrote to the local press defending, as Nick Clegg has done, the rights of religious slaughter, and somebody wrote back saying, have you ever been to an abattoir? I didn't actually prolong the correspondence to say, I think if you've ever been to an abattoir, it'll probably turn you into a vegetarian. I'm absolutely satisfied, and my party is absolutely satisfied that we will defend the rights of religious slaughter. So far as Sharia courts is concerned and other religious courts, I think the essential thing is that if a court is exercising power over people, it is either doing so through the power of the state, or it is doing so through the consent of the parties concerned to submit to the jurisdiction of that court. if two Jews wish to submit to the jurisdiction of the Beth Din, or two Muslims wish to submit to the jurisdiction of the Sharia court to determine their dispute, then I am entirely happy with that. And absolutely, from the point of view of religious discrimination, you can't treat one different to the other.
Adele, if I can ask you to make it quick, because there's still a few areas,
Okay,
sorry.
I will, yes. Well, I'm a farmer's granddaughter, so I did go to slaughterhouses very young, and it did turn me vegetarian. We don't have a policy on religious slaughter. We care about the welfare of the animal all the way through the slaughterhouse. We'd like CCTV in the slaughterhouse on that one. On religious attire, I'm really glad we live in a country, unlike the other countries that are less tolerant. My sons have been to two schools where people could wear their religious attire. They're so used to it that they'd be absolutely shocked if it wasn't allowed. I think the only time someone might have to remove it is if the need for identification, in which case it should be done in a very careful and discreet way. At Sharia courts, I found this really interesting to read in your manifesto, especially on the subject of student finance. I didn't realise that Muslim people can't have certain types of interest, and it made me think, actually, do I want those student loans from certain finance companies? This is an ethical question for all of us, very important one. So I'm really pleased, actually, that the Green Party would scrap tuition fees. We would pay for it by raising corporation tax, which is the lowest in the G7 countries. That would make universities more open to Muslims and others.
Right, we want to wrap up by 4. There's 2 big sections to get through, the counter-terrorism legislation and PREVENT, and foreign policy. If your questions on this are urgent, then please ask them. If not, can we move on, please, if that's all right? Go on.
I have a question for you. It's for all the candidates. And it's regarding the Liberal Home Minister in 2013. He said that the niqab issue had to be looked at, which was a debate. Would you ever consider legislation on niqab or any religious attire?
I think they've all, if I can speak on your behalf, would not vote in favour of a ban on niqab. Anyone object if I've got that wrong? Okay. Very quickly, Selma.
So Jack Straw must have been wrong when he refused, or when he said that he would not meet his constituents if they came with niqab. So we can assume that anyone who says that in the UK, we think that is wrong.
Well, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, is the reality. But Jack Straw reversed his comments, as you know, at a Mend Hustings publicly, where he was asked, I was actually chairing Hustings at the time, I say this because you've mentioned it, he was sitting to my right and he publicly reversed his position. Okay. All right, that's fine. Let's move on now, in that case. Quick one on student loans. Hopefully this is a yes or a no, and then we will move on to the 2 core areas we have left. The UK is aspiring to become the centre of Islamic finance. How are you going to support the development and delivery of Sharia-compliant student loans? So I guess, would you support draft legislation, a bill on Sharia-compliant student loans? Starting from the left, Adele?
I would supply it if it was needed, but we would scrap tuition fees by raising corporation tax and providing a grant and not charging, which would help far more Muslims get into university.
Jonathan?
Yeah, clearly it is a need that must be addressed and should be, absolutely.
Okay, so you would support Sharia-compliant student loans. Yeah, Sarah?
Yeah, I completely agree, and you're right to say that the UK is becoming a centre for Islamic finance, and the firm my dad used to work at was a real centre that specialised in this, and I think it's quite right that this be applied to student loans as well, and that's something that government can work on. It can be something we can resolve.
Okay. And Michael?
The beauty is Finchley and Golders Green has one of the world's leading scholars on Sharia-compliant banking products, which is Mufti Bakatullah, and he's actually very heavily involved with the banking system, and I think his expertise should be used by the student loans company to ensure we have Sharia-compliant student loans.
Wondering who you were going to refer to. Right, let's move on to a question we have on PREVENT and counter-terrorism. Who's asking this? Yes, sir.
The PREVENT strategy, it's kind of widely, I think, within the Muslim community, is viewed as a complete disaster and very counterproductive. The government has boycotted like mainstream organisations like MCB.
Bit louder, sorry, we can't hear you.
The government has boycotted working with mainstream Muslim organisations like MCB. How do they expect to solve the problem without engaging with the Muslim community on this issue? That's the first question. Secondly, when the government is consulting with Muslim community, they're consulting with people that do not represent the Muslim community. For example, the Quilliam Foundation one of the main representatives from here is Martin Nawaz, who was recently exposed to be going to strip clubs and all this kind of stuff.
Okay, can we leave the detail? I'm sorry, we're in a mosque. I think everybody knows how he was exposed in the mail, but anywhere else, sorry, I wouldn't have stopped you, but as we're in a mosque.
Yeah,
okay, sorry.
just with regards to what was Mike Freer's voting record on the recent terrorism legislation that's been put, if you could clarify that as well, please.
So can I just understand here? Prevent has been a disaster from a Muslim community perspective is what you're saying. What presumably will the parties do to make it more effective? Mainstream Muslim organisations have been boycotted by the government, like the Muslim Council of Britain for argument's sake, and instead dealing with organisations like the Quilliam Foundation, who, yes, I think everyone in the Muslim community will accept has virtually no credibility in the Muslim community. And how did Mike vote on the counter-terrorism legislation? All right, well, let's give Mike a second to put his responses to that and start with Jonathan first.
Government clearly needs to engage with the Muslim community through those bodies that you consider. It is for the Muslim community to decide which bodies represent the Muslim community, and government needs to engage. And government needs to engage with those bodies. I had a debate in another hat with the Board of Deputies engaging with the Muslim Council of Britain, which was opposed by some, and I strongly supported it. Regarding the counter-terrorism legislation, I am very concerned, and the Liberal Democrats are very concerned, that if as a result of terrorism, and clearly there have been serious terrorist attacks both in this country and even more seriously and more recently in other countries, but if as a result of terrorist attacks we deny fundamental civil liberties, then the terrorists have won. And that is a debate that has been, again, one of the biggest debates within government between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives in the coalition to ensure that we do not give up our fundamental civil liberties.
Okay, did you answer everything? I think you did, yeah. Adele?
Yes, I was very surprised to read about Prevent in your manifesto and the way that school children are being treated, especially very young ones, having had sons who go to schools and from my oldest son's best friend is Muslim and mixing with them, and there's so much open dialogue. It would be so easy to engage with the Muslim community on this rather than doing it the way they are. So I agree with what's been said so far. You should engage with them. There's something called the dark web, the people who really are terrorists. They use a kind of...
Do the Greens feel Prevent's been a failure, Adele? Do the Greens feel Prevent's been a failure?
I haven't asked the Greens on this, but reading the manifesto, it certainly didn't look like something that I felt
I think you
was the
should.
right way to do it.
Just so you know the answer.
I think I will.
Go on. I'm sorry, on boycotting apologies, on the other points about boycotting Muslim organisations, the mainstream representatives, which this government clearly has done, officially, pretty much. What's your view on that? Would the Greens do the same? Or?
I think it's very important to have that dialogue with the Muslim community in their organisations. Yes, it's essential.
Right, Sarah.
Let me start by saying something which may sound a bit unexpected. I don't stand here saying that Labour has always got things right. I think one of the first mistakes we made was in calling this strategy Prevent, because it sounded like there was some inherent danger in the Muslim community which we were somehow trying to prevent. And I don't say that Labour governments in the past have always got it right on civil liberties and counter-terrorism legislation either. In fact, I think a lot of what the previous Labour government did a great deal of harm to alienate the government and the Muslim community. And I think the first way to starting to get things right is to acknowledge that. So, I know, cheesy as it sounds, I think actually we almost need to start over and maybe dismantle the whole Prevent strategy altogether and reconnect, re-engage with the Muslim community through those bodies that you regard as representative. And that's not going to be the MCB alone. The MCB alone doesn't speak with one voice for the entirety of the Muslim community. We would want to see the direction of travel and the engagement of different bodies before deciding, saying, well, that's the only group that we're going to work with. But do we want to engage? Yes, absolutely. Do we want to move on from the mistakes of the past? Yes, we do. And I think it's no accident that in Ed Miliband, you have a leader of the Labour Party who has signalled a change in direction. In fact, one of the reasons he was able to secure the victory in becoming leader of the party was his opposition to the Iraq War, was his opposition to 42-day detention, the sorts of policies which I think did a lot of harm in terms of damaging relationships between the government at the time, which was a Labour government, and the Muslim community.
So just very quickly on that, Sarah, before you sit down, by the way, if you've got questions, keep your hands up, please. If the community itself recognises organisations like the MCB as its legitimate representative, the way the Jewish community would have the Board of Deputies, for argument's sake, in a sense, why then not deal with them?
I don't think that the Labour Party has said that it would not deal with the MCB.
It did towards the end of its last term.
But the current leadership of the Labour Party hasn't said that it would not deal with the MCB. But as I said, I do think there's a danger in saying this is the exclusive voice of the Muslim community, because I don't think that is correct. I think we actually just need to change the nature of our engagement.
So you certainly wouldn't boycott the MCB, that's what you're saying, but it's not the lone exclusive voice.
I do think, and I think it's an example that Jonathan touched on, it's in particular circumstances, we know that last summer, we may come on to this, the Jewish Board of Deputies and the MCB wrote a joint letter. And I think that shows something very, very important, the willingness of different religious communities to cooperate and work together around specific issues and specific causes. Well, if that's possible between different religious bodies, then why not between political parties and representatives of the Muslim community as well? So I definitely don't rule it out.
Okay, Mike, over to you. And I guess, Mike, you should also touch on the point about how you voted on the counter-terror law, please.
If I can take that bit backwards, if any of us are members of Parliament on May the 8th, we all face having to vote en bloc, particularly on big pieces of legislation, and most of the counter-terrorism legislation went through without a vote because it was cross-party. Only certain elements were their votes. And my approach to that is looking at the total package. Was the total package good, even if elements of it needed addressing? And my approach to, first of all, as a government MP, you are expected to vote with the government. But where you think there are anomalies, rather than scupper a bill which on the whole has a lot of good about it, the best way to deal with it is often go back and have dialogue with your ministerial colleagues. And what I've done in the past is take people in to speak to the relevant minister and say, look, this is an anomaly. This is not what you intended, and this is the bit that needs ironing out, rather than to scupper the whole bill. And unfortunately, when you're the Member of Parliament, you are one of 100 or 200 or 300 people voting. You do have limited power to change a major bill. And so your biggest influence is taking people in to deal with anomalies where you think it's got it wrong. But in terms of the general prevent strategy, and I think actually, to be fair, Hazel Blairs, who was the Secretary of State at the time, Labour, who...
Sorry, just on your specific record was his question. On your specific record was your question, so I'm just having a look at the
I voted for memory, I voted for. I don't remember voting against it, because as I've explained, the whole package was worth supporting, even if there were bits that need addressing. Going back on to the issue on prevent, the thrust... To be fair to Hazel Blairs, who was actually a very, very good Labour minister, who introduced this programme with the best of intentions, and no one can ever challenge her view on trying to build community cohesion. Unfortunately, the title, Preventing Violent Extremism, was the full title, was deeply insulting to the Muslim community. And so whilst the intention was good, some of the side effects were clearly bad. But one of the challenges that I face both as leader of the council but also as a member of Parliament is actually the difficulty we have in engaging with the Islamic community as a whole is a lack of structure. Who do you go to? Who are the leaders? Each of the mosques locally have their own magic committee. There is no one particularly like the Board of Deputies that has a particular view, because half the people in this room would not recognise the MCB and many would.
Shall we put that to a quick straw poll? Who recognises in this room the Muslim Council of Britain as the legitimate representative body of the Muslim community? Probably the majority.
But not
okay,
all.
carry on.
But not all.
Well, I don't think all Jews would recognise the Board of Deputies as representatives either, is the point, but you deal with them.
But in terms of engagement, yes, I have tried to engage. I did write to the MCB asking for a meeting so I could discuss certain issues, but sadly didn't get a response.
Which
But the issue, sorry.
Which issues?
Sorry, let him finish.
Yes.
Sorry.
The issue would have been about general Islamophobia and how we deal with it to ensure that I was fully informed. But in terms of the other issues about DCLG, from memory, because I used to sit alongside Eric Pickles at DCLG, when Baroness Varsi was a minister at DCLG, she did meet with the MCB, is my understanding. And so, whilst I know others haven't, but I think she did. So, but my personal opinion is that if the community chooses and elects a body to represent them, then engagement should follow. But the bottom line is, one thing that we all have to work on is the capacity and structures so that politicians, whether they are MPs or councillors, have people of authority that we can engage with and so that we can deal with and get informed and address issues. One of the problems that we face is that the community Islamic community is fragmented and there is not a common voice and a common board that we can go to for an authoritative decision.
All right, so there's going to be a few questions on this. Let's take one at a time. I'm going to give preference to people who've not asked a question. So gentleman there first and then gentleman at the front. We'll take them all together.
Apologies, but it's a bit of a weak excuse to say that the MCB is not representative. I mean, you talk about Baroness Warsi, she's the same Baroness Warsi who resigned from the government and is still working with the MCB, so that doesn't quite hold state. Just want to talk about Prevent specifically and what you're planning on doing now. So I'm working with some of the local faith community schools, and they seem to be really concerned with what the strategy is moving forward. There's a strategy from the counter-terrorism unit and the direction that's come as a policy perspective appears to be pretty much null and void. So it'd be really helpful to hear what you're actually going to do with Prevent moving forward, because Prevent has to be scrapped. It has to be scrapped, and it isn't scrapped. You know, you're not going to have anyone to blame but yourselves, but you really need to sort of explain quite quickly what you're going to do with Prevent, because it's been an absolute disaster, and it's been forced upon the Muslim community, which clearly you've already said yourself, you don't really understand it. You don't understand it, and I appreciate we're not a homogenous community. Africans, Albanians, from subcontinent, completely different. But if you could explain what the Prevent strategy is going to be moving forward, that'd be really helpful.
Might look like. Okay, gentlemen, just keep your hands up, please. That's okay.
I just didn't understand why does the government think there has to be one body that represents the whole entire Muslim community that you would speak to. I mean, if
bodies.
Yeah, but you keep talking about MCB, and because it doesn't represent all the Muslims. I mean, it represents, even though if I didn't agree with the MCB, I know it represents a lot, a big majority. So if you had a few bodies, that's enough. You could talk to them. Why does it have to be? It seems like what the brother said, it's just an excuse.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to take one of the ladies' questions and we'll come back to you guys. That's okay, lady at the front, yeah?
Okay. My name is Poppy, and I'm from Chipping Barnet, which is a neighbouring constituency that surrounds this mosque on 3 sides. And I know that a lot of the members of this mosque come from Chipping Barnet because we don't have a mosque in Chipping Barnet, and I wanted to represent the views of 1 or 2 of your members who've been in touch with me. First of all, saying how overcrowded our mosque is becoming, and that as a result, this lady I was speaking with feels that the women are being squeezed out in order to allow for more worship. I appreciate you have your MEND agenda to further today, but I want to offer my support to a new mosque being established in Chipping Barnet, and I would like to make that happen. And the other thing is, our friend from Sweet Sway had to leave after asking her question because she had to go back to her work at Emporium Cafe on North Finchley. An overwhelming majority, in fact all the families from Sweet Sway who were evicted in a rather unpleasant manner were from abroad, and many of them were Muslims. I was proud to offer them my support, and I regret that I did not see any of the other parties there.
Thank you very much. Lady at the front, yes.
Thank you for giving me that opportunity to speak.
You're most welcome.
I just wanted to ask, what are the British values referred to in the CTS legislation? And do the candidates recognise that such ambiguous legislation will cause
us all problems.
Okay, and then on this side, gentlemen, same question.
I was going to she's picking Mike Free up when he said about Baroness Farsi. In her article itself, in The Guardian, she says that a structure, some progress was made in establishing some form of structure within which engagement take place. For example, the cross-government anti-Muslim hatred working group. But apart from my friend Eric Pickles, not a single Secretary of State engaged with it.
Okay, the cross-party anti-Muslim hate group, and I think you have asked a question. What's yours?
I'd like to echo,
last one, and then we'll answer them together.
I'd like to echo what the lady on my right said and what Sarah also said.
Well, can you ask the question, please?
It's about the Human Rights Act. The whole world, including Nelson Mandela, embraced Human Rights Act. Why does the British government have to do something different and hope that it'll be better than the Human Rights Act?
Okay, all right. So those are the questions, just very quickly, so the panel know which ones. And as I say, I've still got foreign policy to end on. So the point about why must there be one representative body for the government to deal with the Muslim community? There can be 2 or 3. In fact, in other communities there are more than one. The counter-terrorism strategy, Prevent being a disaster. What's the future of Prevent going to look like? The mosque in Chipping Barnet. Assuming you feel that's relevant to your discussion. British values being ambiguous. What are British values? And we should all embrace human rights. Mandela and the others did, so why don't we? Right, shall we start very quickly, please, on all of them, if that's okay. Adele, start with you and then go to Jonathan.
Yeah, first I agree very much that we need more mosques. That's come across very clearly to people who've written to the Green Party, to me and Poppy. I didn't mean one representative body, I meant we really need to have dialogue and work with Muslims on these issues. The Human Rights Act we would certainly not scrap. The British values, what are British values? Well, part of what British values are tolerance of religions, very different to the way other secular countries don't allow religious dress, don't allow religious slaughter, don't allow so many of these things, and partly because of the pressures that I know people fear about religious slaughter and other things. I've looked at those countries to see the kind of compromises they reach, and it's made me realise just how rich and multicultural we are and how much we enjoy that in London. So I think British values are the multicultural values that we have now, tolerance.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan.
I think one British value is the rule of law. And one concept of the rule of law is that you don't enact in legislation or other things that have sanctions, like Ofsted requirements, something that you can't define. And unless you can clearly define British values, it can't actually be made part of an Ofsted framework or legislation. But let me just give an example of a British value. The European Convention of Human Rights, which became the Human Rights Act, was largely drafted by British lawyers, largely actually British Conservative lawyers, actually. And we as Liberal Democrats are absolutely determined to maintain that legislation. If there had been a majority Conservative government 5 years ago, it would have been repealed by now. We stopped it being repealed because it sets out some values that we regard as fundamental British values: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to life, the right to private life, all absolute fundamental values. But I have to say I share the lady's concern on putting on using the phrase British values, and particularly using it in penal or Ofsted context, because I feel that it's ill defined.
Okay, Sarah.
I think you're right that politicians or people who are aspiring to be part of government cannot use as an excuse the fact that there isn't one homogenous single body for not engaging. Clearly, as you've described, the Muslim community is much more variegated and heterogeneous than perhaps many who are less familiar with it account for. But I would also say that the responsibility lies not just with the politicians, but with the Muslim community as a whole, to be organised, to advocate, to be organised within your community so that you can wield influence as a community. And it's important too that at every echelon of our nation's public life, whether it's in government, whether it's in business or whatever, we need more prominent Muslim voices to be the advocates for that. And that's why I'm proud that there are voices within my own party, which is, of all the major parties, arguably the most diverse, with prominent figures such as Sadiq Khan, Shaban Mahmood, and others, just to take a couple of examples. But I think it takes two to tango. The politicians need to be aware of who are the bodies who speak for the Muslim community and not use it as an excuse they have to engage, but the community itself has to be organised through things like today, in fact. I think this is a really good example of just that. On British values, I really agree. I think when we use concepts like this, particularly if they're being used in legislation, that is pretty dangerous territory. Because actually, apart from the rule of law and tolerance, which others have spoken about, one of the things is, like all values, British values are a contested concept. And I think that's what became so dangerous and so heated around the whole issue of the Trojan schools debate. Who are these British values? To me, there's not necessarily anything mutually exclusive between Islamic values, British values, or what have you. And I think that we stray into dangerous territory when we seek to legislate for those kind of things. But what we do legislate for is for the rule of law and the protection of our fundamental rights. It was Labour that introduced the 1998 Human Rights Act. The reason we did that was to bring the rights of the European Convention home so that you could enforce it in domestic courts. And as a public lawyer who uses this in her daily work, I promise you that if Labour is elected, we will defend them to the hilt.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike?
The issue I think I said about the MCB is a lack of bodies. If I didn't say bodies, then I'm sorry. The point is, as a politician in the local area trying to engage a diverse constituency, it is frustrating when you can't go to someone for an authority view on what is, when you're trying to frame legislation, is who do you talk to who can give you an authoritative view on what the Quran would say or what is Islamic teaching, in the same way that I can go to other faiths and get a view on what that religion says. And that's important for those of us who aren't of the faith, that we need guidance and education as to how legislation needs to be cognizant of particular religious sensitivities. But in terms of the English or British values, it's about non-discrimination. It's about tolerance. It's about the rule of law. It's about the respect for our differences. And it's also about religious tolerance, not just tolerance of views, but the freedom of expression. And by saying to people loud and clear, these are our values, you can also say that that community shares our values, look at what they're saying. And that community shares our values, look at what they're saying. So I don't see arguing for British values is a bad thing, because it allows to point to all communities and say their values are our values, they are British values, and it helps to undermine those who seek to divide. And in terms of the European Court of Human Rights, I would have preferred an opportunity to make it work, rather than to simply walk away from it. And now, my personal view is I want to see, I know what my manifesto commitment is. I can't say I'm greatly enthusiastic about it. No candidate will be enthusiastic about the whole manifesto. My job would be to ensure that the voice of reason is saying, why are we doing this? Is this the right thing to be doing? Because I'm not sure it is, but we have to, I'd prefer to have said, can we make it work for us, rather than actually choosing to walk away from it.
So just on that, obviously the Conservatives have said they'll scrap the Human Rights Act and effectively adopt a Bill of Rights. What's that going to look like? Who will you consult? How will you ensure people's views are taken care of, and so on? Where do you draw a Bill of Rights from?
Well, the Bill of Rights, like any new legislation, has to go through a very long and lengthy pre-legislative consultation, where you seek the views not only of lawyers and those who are in the judiciary, those who are involved in the practice of the European Court of Human Rights, but also, most importantly, the public. Because unless the public feel that a UK Bill of Rights gives them the same level of protection, then they won't approve it. And if it doesn't have public support, then obviously legislation going through the House of Commons will encounter difficulty. It's a long process.
So, well, do you promise that you won't rush it through the way you rush the counter-terrorism legislation?
I can say that if I was in charge of the schedule, that I wouldn't be rushing it through.
Okay, so just before we end on foreign, hands up if you've got questions. Before we end on foreign policy, the gentleman asked a question which hasn't been fully answered, and that was specifically your incumbent MPs at the time's record on voting when it came to the counter-terrorism legislation. So I'm just going to read it from Hansard factually as it stands, and Mike can happily intervene in this. So when it came to an appeal on passports, so you know the way the counter-terrorism legislation works, I apologise if I just explaining it, I know the candidates will definitely know about this, and I'm sure some of the audience do. if there's reasonable cause to suspect you're leaving the UK for terrorist activity, then the police and border patrol officers at Heathrow, Colin, or technically any airport or port, can take your passport without at that point in time giving you the reason. Now that passport can be held for up to 14 days was the whole idea, and then on the back of a court being involved can be extended to up to 30 days. So the position from the Liberal Democrat and the Labour perspective was to try and introduce an appeal against the passport being taken at 7 days. So at 7 days you're able to go to a court and appeal. Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, but Hansard shows Mike voted against the right for appeal on that. The second point here is temporary exclusion orders. So this was the system whereby Theresa May was interested, Theresa May's plan was pretty much for her as Home Secretary, or whoever was the Home Secretary at the time, to have the power to exclude a British citizen who'd been suspected of being involved in extremist activity outside of the UK for up to 2 years, without a court being involved. Labour and Lib Dems, and Men was involved in the process, and so was Liberty, campaigned hard for a court to have to sign off you being kept outside of the UK if you had been involved in extremist activity. Mike Freer voted against a court being involved. In other words, the Home Secretary should have direct power to keep you out without a court being involved. And the third of the three, it'll be interesting to hear all of the panel's views on this. The third of the three is a sunset clause. Sunset clause basically means the date at which the legislation becomes ineffective, and you've got to re-debate it and go live with the new version. So again, the likes of Labour and the Lib Dems were interested in December 2016 being the sunset clause, the date on when this legislation effectively is rendered void and new legislation has got to be put through. Let me get this right. Mike again voted against the sunset clause being the case. Mike, feel free if I've got anything wrong from Hansard. So what would be interesting on these three specific points, if all of the candidates just let us know how they would have voted, and Mike can defend his record. So very quickly, starting from Adele. How would you have voted on each three? The appeal on the passport on 7 days, the judicial oversight in terms of 2 years being kept outside the UK, and the sunset clause.
I disagree with Mike Freer's voting through this Parliament on everything apart from one thing that isn't on this. My son goes around with his best friend who's Muslim. I have to worry every time he travels in case his friend's passport is taken. I grew up in Northern Ireland. The British government is still seeing films of the problems we have from doing things like this, excluding British citizens for up to 1 to 2 years with no court. There should be a court involved. We shouldn't be making that mistake again. And as I disagree with this legislation, then I would be for the sunset clause. So
on all 3 points you disagree with how Mike voted, yeah? Jonathan?
On legislation, going back to the rule of law, if people's rights are being taken away from them because it is suspected they have done something wrong, creation of a passport, for example, then that should be the subject of assessment by the court, not owned by a court, not the Home Secretary. On the question of the sunset clause, the reason there was a sunset clause in the legislation in the first place was because Liberal Democrat ministers insisted on it, and the purpose of the timing was to force it to be an issue for debate in this general election, and to then force the legislation to have to be renewed soon after this general election. Could have been the 31st December 2015, but certainly early 2016 is quite long enough to achieve that.
So the third. Sorry, so just to be clear, because I don't think you addressed one of the 3 points, which was the judicial oversight on temporary exclusion orders. Were you in favour of judicial oversight? Yes. Okay, so you disagree with Mike on all 3 points. Sarah?
Again, and forgive me for speaking as a lawyer yet again, I disagree with the way Mike voted on all 3 counts. I think that the principle of judicial oversight in this field, in this broad field of anti-terrorism legislation, is so critical. I believe the right to a lawyer is absolutely critical. I believe the right to decent standards of proof, reasonable suspicion, is absolutely critical. I'm afraid this country doesn't have a great track record on this, but I'm afraid nor does this government, and I would have voted differently from Mike on all 3 counts.
Okay. Mike, over to you.
First of all, I have to say that I think that the positioning is unfair, because if anybody is here, is elected as a member of Parliament, they will be subject to their party whip. And if they're a member of a government member, they are expected to support government legislation. To suggest that any one of us has a carte blanche to vote on every clause individually is a simple nonsense.
Not true, the Greens are not whipped.
Well, there's only one of them that can't be whipped,
finish.
unless she's going to whip herself.
Sorry, Mike, carry on.
So the bottom line is, if Sarah is a member, as a Labour MP, she will be subject to the Labour whip, as would Jeremy. And if there's more than one Green MP, they might just get a whip. And so to suggest that you can vote on everything in accordance to how your personal views is simply doesn't happen. Now you might argue it should, but it's not the way the system works. We are expected, you are elected as a government MP, and you're expected to support the government on their legislation. Now on these particular ones, I may or may not have had personal disquiet. I like sunset clauses, I like judicial review. But when you are sat in front of the minister responsible for counter-terrorism, who tells you, Mike, I need this, so for instance on 14 days, I need this because if we suspect someone has been involved in terrorism and we need 14 days to investigate and build a case, then I have to say, Minister, if that's what you are telling me, based on the information being provided to you by government lawyers and the intelligence services, I have to trust what the Minister says because I do not have access and none of us would have access to all of the details provided by the security services. On many occasions, we vote for things as members of Parliament that we think are draconian. Now you may think that ministers hide behind the intelligence service. They may well do. But if the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister, responsible for the defence of this country, says, I need this legislation to keep you safe and me safe, then I have to give him that trust, whether I have concerns or not.
Okay. All right, so if you put your hands up if you've got questions, please. I'm just going to ask, just from an acid test perspective, Sarah, Jonathan and Adele, because I have some sympathy with Mike's position, actually. If the party view was you have to vote in favour of all of them, he's torn between his party's view and the individual constituents' views, isn't he? But let's ask the same question of Sarah, Jonathan and Adele. But let's just ask the same question, see if they're willing to answer this. If their party's view was the same as the Conservatives' party view, i.e. in favour of each one of the three issues, would they have voted against it?
I think the simple point is it wasn't the position of our parties. No, but that's important. You know, at this general election, yes, you're voting for individuals who each bring their individual skills and views, but you're also voting for a party with a set of values. And you know that on this debate, the Conservatives, Liberals and Labour took different viewpoints. And actually, the way that Jonathan and I have said we would vote was actually in accordance with the way our party was suggesting that we vote. And I think that's all you need to know. To talk about virtual scenarios, what it would have been if I'd actually been sitting in the Conservative Party, I'm glad to say I'm not in the Conservative Party. End of story.
Okay, all right. You're not going to answer my question, that's fine. You're going to make a great politician, Sarah. Jonathan and Adele, would you have voted against your party? Sorry, I just want to be fair to Mike, that's all.
I think I agree with Sarah, only to add that one of the roles of a Member of Parliament, when ministers say we need this for reasons of national security, is to ask some very searching questions.
Okay, Adele.
Yes, well, my party would never have had these, so but I would vote against them. We're told very clearly we're a democratic, we're not a whipped party, it doesn't matter how many MPs we have. Some parties now are using a 3-line whip, which means serious consequences if you don't vote with that party. The 3-line whip should only be used on absolutely essential voting. It's being used on other things. So, no, I'm very pleased I'm in a party that doesn't do that.
Okay, final question, and it's to do with Palestine and Israel, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Who's asking that question? Yourself, sir.
You give me the occasion to speak about another vulnerable piece of legislation, which is the rules to put evidence in court by the prosecution.
It's not really related to this final point, but go on. If the panelists... Okay, ask your question on this, and then just ask that as well, and if the panelists want to answer it.
You describe the candidates here as being all the friends of Israel. It's quite sad that we don't have among our candidates people who are friends of Palestinians, who have been dispossessed.
Well, Sarah, would you join Labour Friends of Palestine if you were elected?
I've been to many of their events, and don't misunderstand that if one is a friend of Israel, one isn't a friend of Palestine. Actually, I think true friends of Israel ought to be friends of Palestinians as well.
Okay. In last month's election, Netanyahu said that under him there will be no Palestinian state, and that the settlements will continue.
Illegal
What do you think about it?
Sorry, just repeat the question, if that's all right.
Netanyahu, after his election or during his campaign, he said...
No, I got it. I was going to repeat it for the audience, for the people on that side of the fence, yeah.
Right. He said that under him there will be no Palestinian state. Begging before him, he said, on the Oslo Agreement, if it were for me, I would have dragged them for 10 years. So there doesn't seem to be any willingness to try and compromise with the Palestinians. What is the position of the panel, considering that Mike has resigned from government to vote against the motion recognizing a Palestinian state?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question, sorry, if you haven't got this fully. So basically the question is, last month, or maybe it was the month before, in the Israeli elections, Prime Minister Netanyahu said pretty much during my time, there will be no Palestinian state. He later reversed that, just so you know, after he was elected. You can call it political chicanery, call it what you want. But nonetheless, he said under his watch there will be no Palestinian state. And the question goes further along the lines of boycotts of produce from Israeli settlements. Would the panelists support settlements that are illegal in the West Bank on Palestinian land, on land that the UN recognizes as illegal? Would they support a boycott on those illegal settlements? They might as well make their view on further settlements clear as well here. And then the gentleman ended by talking about the fact that when Parliament, remember this is not binding on the government, this vote, but when Parliament decided 274 to 12 to recognize a Palestinian state, this was last October, if I'm not wrong, or something like that, Mike resigned in protest of Parliament's recognition of a Palestinian state. So that's more for Mike to answer rather than the other panelists. So the whole question... Sorry?
Just have to get a mic there.
Yeah, it's a mic. It's a mic. Is there something wrong with the mic?
No.
Oh, sorry. We should perhaps have had 5. I apologise. Right. Okay. So let's. This is the last question. If you have a question at the back, you have your hands up. But first, let's get the panelists' response to those 2 or 3 issues together. You had 2 or 3 questions. I've just bunched them all into one from what you've given me at the mosque. So let's start with Adele Ward and maybe Caroline Lucas's. Whatever your formal stance is as a party as well.
Yes, I'll give both of those. It was very sad to hear this from Netanyahu, who I see though that his president is a little bit more open-minded, which was good to read. I'm not in any group. I think it's important for a politician to rise above it and to look after the whole community and to be the voice for all of you. And we certainly do work on this. Candidates who work with women in black and so on. To help the people in Gaza, and I do talk to them and hear exactly what's going on because I haven't been there. We recognise we want a 2-state solution, both Israel and Palestine, safe and secure. So we support that. The Green Party does support a boycott on the settlements, but I really want to talk to people to hear that that is not also hurting people too much, because I'm getting different views on it. So I'd want to hear that myself.
Okay, that's fine. Jonathan.
Dare I say, a panel of politicians, a day before, 24 hours before an election when he thought he was going to lose, politicians say things and give pledges that they may later come to regret. And Netanyahu, I think, has rowed back from those remarks, and certainly some of the remarks he made just on polling day, I think it was, are very regrettable. It is worth remembering the only peace agreements Israel has ever negotiated with Egypt and with Jordan, but particularly with Egypt, involving the complete withdrawal from Sinai, were negotiated by a right-wing Israeli government led by Menachem Begin. And it is odd that 6 weeks after the Israeli election, there is still no government. I hope we'll do better in this. I hope we'll do better in this country 6 weeks after polling day. The Liberal Democrat position is that there must be a 2-state solution involving a secure and stable Palestinian state and a secure and stable Israeli state. That will only be achieved by negotiations between the 2 parties on the ground. As part of that negotiation, and at the end of that process, there will of course be recognition of a Palestinian state. But to do it, but a unilateral step in that respect, we think would not help the situation, and we think would be wrong. Ultimately, the two parties have to negotiate, and we hope that Britain, as part of the Quartet, as part of the European Union, and the rest of the Western world will support negotiations between the parties.
So what's your view on settlements then in that case? Do you condemn the continuation of illegal settlements on illegal land, should we say, and do you or do you not support the boycott on produce from settlements?
I do not support any boycotts because I don't think boycotts promote dialogue. And I think everybody recognises that the ultimate solution will involve land swaps, which will involve most of the settlements becoming part of Israel in return for equivalent land passing into the Palestinian state.
Okay, and okay, so you answered that. Just very quickly, do you support boycotts against North Korea and Iran in that case?
I don't. We
About
support
the period,
dialogue.
Okay, Sarah.
Forgive me if I speak a little personally for a second. I grew up in the Jewish community. My cousins live in Jerusalem, and I've been travelling to Israel and to the occupied territories for some years now. I go there pretty much once every year. So this is both a deeply personal issue for me, as well as one of political relevance, not just, of course, to the Jewish community, but to the Muslim communities and Palestinians right across the world. And as someone who, you're right, whoever's pointed it out, I am a friend of Israel. My cousins are Israeli citizens. But being a friend of Israel, what I want to see more than anything is two states for two peoples, both for the dignity and the independence of Palestinians and for the future of a secure and safe Israel. And my party also believes in seeing a negotiated two-state solution. I'll be completely honest, I was deeply disappointed by the victory of Bibi Netanyahu in the recent Israeli elections. I actually wrote about it publicly. I put a tweet to say that I regarded his election in the light of his statements as a blow to peace, a comment for which I received some criticism. But I do find it intensely frustrating that 25 years since the Oslo Accord, since what felt like progress with the image of Yasser Arafat shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin on the White House lawn, that so little progress has been made and that the cycle of violence between the two peoples, particularly in Gaza, continues. And I do regard the rhetoric that Mr. Netanyahu, in the same way that I regard the rhetoric of Hamas as deeply unhelpful to bringing the negotiations which we need to fruition. I think his comments were deeply regrettable, as do I regard the continued policies which support settlement expansion. And the reason I'm so deeply against them is because I think they make the two-state solution a more and more remote possibility. And so I think it's possible to be a friend of Israel, but also to criticize the actions of the Israeli government, where they make us more and more far away from the two-state solution. With regard to the boycott question, I'm against boycotts, particularly academic and cultural boycotts, because I think they do the opposite of fostering dialogue. I know there are others who think that they could perhaps engender a breakthrough and a change in direction. I personally disagree with that. I also, for the same reason, disagree with my own party's stance on the unilateral declaration of Palestinian statehood. Basically, because I don't think it changes the reality on the ground for somebody living in Ramallah or Jenin or in Gaza, and because I think actually it pulls the two sides further apart and makes it less likely that they will actually sit down and broker the deal, which ultimately can only come from them.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Mike's going to answer, and then we'll take our final round of questions. If I can please ask somebody to keep the children a little quiet, I do apologise. Yeah, it's disturbing things on this side. Mike, over to you.
Let's take a couple of the minor ones first, and I'll come back to my vote. The settlements, I've already on record as saying that I think that the expansion of the settlements is wrong and will not further the peace settlement. In terms of boycotts, no, because I actually think they will damage ordinary Palestinians first. It's easy when we're sat in our nice, warm, comfortable homes in Finchley and Golders Green to think it's a good idea. But it's a different thing when you're stood in Ramallah seeing the level of unemployment at 50% and say we should be boycotting so that we can create more unemployment just because it makes us feel better. So I don't think it would help ordinary Palestinians, and that's why I don't think the boycotts is a good thing. I support a two-state negotiated solution. And being a friend of Israel does not mean you can't be a friend of the Palestinians. They are not mutually exclusive. We will agree on the outcome. We may disagree on the journey. And the reason why I resigned my position so I could vote is because I did not support a premature recognition of the state of Palestine, because it doesn't meet the requirements of statehood by international standards. You have to have, as a basis, agreed borders, agreed security. You also have to have both sides agreeing that each other can exist. And one of the real issues that really caused me some major concern was the involvement of Hamas. When Hamas Charter says that Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth and all Jews in the world should be killed, I could not do anything that gave encouragement to Hamas rather than to Fatah. And I say, well, that's in the Hamas Charter.
You can challenge him in a second. I believe Hamas have changed it, but you can challenge him in a
The last
second.
version of the Hamas Charter that I saw still had that. And I say to this audience, would this meeting be allowed by Hamas, where you are able to openly challenge your politicians? Would you have Christians and Jews sat here arguing about politics and policy if we had a Hamas government?
Yes.
And on
yes,
that basis,
yes. No, Mr. Pitt.
You can answer him in a second, please. Hold on. Hold on, Mike. Right, guys, just put your hands up, please. You can answer him in a second. Let him finish first, please.
You can disagree with me.
That is unfair.
Excuse me.
It might be unfair.
Unfair.
You can disagree with me. I'm explaining how I came to my point of view. You can disagree with it, but I'm explaining how I came to my decision. I do not believe that this would exist. This meeting, our pluralism, our democracy would exist in a Hamas-led government, and I did not think that vote would put peace any step closer.
Thank you very much. Right, okay, right, lots of hands, and we'll try and get... Excuse me, sir, can you please have some respect for protocol? I will ask you a question, don't worry.
I am Palestinian,
Right.
I have the
I know, but one person at a time. Sir,
I want to speak.
Sir, I will let him speak. With respect, please have some respect for the authority of the chair. Right. First of all, gentlemen at the back, your question, please.
My question to you is this. Your close friends, United States Vice President, million times, thousand times, recognize the two-state of Palestine and Israel by living peacefully towards each other. Secondly, they are saying that the settlement on Gaza Strip or Rafah is illegal. But European Parliament has already proven that the two-state of Palestine and Israel should be recognized. You are not respecting all the democratic countries, right? You are not respecting any other world community. Whatever Israelis wanted to do against Palestinians, they are thinking that is the right thing. What I'm saying is this to you. What I'm saying to you.
Just your question, please.
My question is that if you are not recognizing the Palestinian state, if you're not stopping your settlement in Gaza, how could you be able to speak with Palestinians if you're not doing this?
Okay. Right. Who else had a question? Okay, gentlemen at the back, and then both of yourselves as well. And we'll take them all together. Yes, yourself.
I make apologies again for not standing up, but let me just point out this. The fact that people make derogatory remarks about Hamas is misconceived. Let me just explain something. The Palestinians lived with the Jews and gave them protection throughout history. It is the Christians who persecuted the Jews, not the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And I am a Palestinian, I was born there, I'm dispossessed, I'm a refugee, I came to this country, and I've lost my land. Now, with regards to you, Jeremy, you say that you approve of the settlements, and then we give you another piece of land. Isn't that unjust? I mean, the fact that we are politicians, we are supposed to set the standards for being fair and equitable. Where is the fairness in actually dispossessing the Palestinians from their land, not allowing them to build houses and even renovate their houses, and yet say, well, we're going to take that into proper Israel, and now we're going to give you some remote parts in the desert. This is most unjust. Isn't it time that the politicians has to be honest and put honesty and integrity and equity before their party line and vote for the dispossessed? This is what is causing the friction between the Muslims in Britain at large and the government. That's the first thing. The second thing, I just wanted to raise two questions about the legal aid, the fact that the government has actually wind down the legal aid and it is actually preventing many people who need access to justice and they're not getting it. And the third point is about the bureaucracy in the National Health Service. I want to finish this point, please.
Please, and if you keep your hands up if you've got further questions.
The bureaucracy in the National Health Service, as vowed by many practitioners, is usurping much of the funds available to the National Health Service for the benefit of the management and denying it to patients and the preventive.
Thank you very much.
Will the panel promote the reduction in spending on management of the National Health Service and provide it for their frontline?
Okay, that's fine. Guys, very quickly, your questions in 10 seconds each. Did you have a question? Yes. Very quickly, please.
Just my question is regarding to Mike. So he said he resigned from when there was voting for the settlement of the Palestine or for the recognition of Palestine.
Yes.
And then when it comes to something like to the Muslim community, to the passport, to court appeal, these things, and here, because we are the people voting him to take him to the parliament, to me what I learned from his word, there is no value for our vote. When it comes to the point, there is value just for the party, so he give priority to the party.
Sorry, so what is your question that he voted in line with the party whip, so you felt he was less concerned about your local constituents' view on it and more of party's view?
What
Is that
I'm
your
saying,
point?
when he resigned from in that point, when something goes against the Israeli government, why he cannot resign when something goes against the Muslim community?
Right, gentleman here in the front stripe shirt, very quickly. All the panelists are going to respond, don't worry. But very quickly, your question.
Mr. Frey went on record saying that first.
A bit louder, please.
Mr. Frey went on record saying that he's one of the 12 because you need to know where the borders are. Now the thing is, how can you know where the borders are when you have illegal settlements? The borders are changing all the time. So why don't you go on record in public and actually condemn this, rather than just the one side, and you talk about Hamas. Actually, the West Bank is run by the Palestinian Authority. Nothing to do with Hamas. So please, you need to talk about two separate people. Hamas and Palestinian Authority are two separate.
Okay, and final question from this gentleman, panelists and answer, and we wrap this up. Yes?
2 points. First of all, I think there are double standards. So when it comes to boycotting Iran, when it comes to boycotting USSR or Russia, then it's okay. But when it comes to boycotting Israeli illegal settlement goods, the Palestinians will suffer. No, they will not suffer. The rich will get richer and the poor will still get poorer. They are being oppressed. That's number one. Why don't they challenge this? The second thing is this about we're talking about borders, etc. Well, I've got here a long list of terrorism that the Jews did, including someone who became Prime Minister. And the British government did not have any problem in dealing with them. But they've got problems with Hamas. Golda Meir was a terrorist who blew up the Hotel David. And what about that? They didn't deal with them. What about dealing with Hamas? They are representing the people, elected people.
Well, let's let the panelists give you their answers to those questions. Who are we going to start? Who wants to go first, guys? Go on, Adele, you go first.
Yes, on the question of dealing with Hamas, having grown up in Northern Ireland, I remember my family, my mother being worried about this voting in a left-wing government that would deal with the terrorists. In fact, it was only when Tony Blair, I don't have much that I can say good about him, but he did talk to the terrorists, and that's how they managed to get peace, and that's why some of the people who they would never have talked to sit down together, the people from Ian Paisley's old party, the people from the IRA and Sinn Féin, sit down together now, so peace is possible, and the way it's done is by talking, just as you're saying, we do have to talk to the other side. I don't know if you want to talk on the other, there's the NHS spending, and just
we'll just finish on this. Jonathan?
There clearly has to be dialogue. But you can't have dialogue with people who do not recognise your right to live and exist. My understanding of Hamas is the same as the same of Mike's. If its position has changed, I will be delighted. I will be delighted to hear it. Israel under Sharon, another right-wing person with whom many of us would probably not wish to share the light of day, withdrew from Gaza, and the result was missiles from Gaza. Let me just finally agree with the gentleman who referred to the Palestinians having lived with the Jews. One of them, I fear we may have to agree to differ on Middle East politics. I hope that will not stop us working together on many other issues where there is common cause.
Sarah, and then Mike will have the final word.
I think ultimately, as others have said, we all want to see a negotiated two-state solution, and that means negotiations, okay? And it means negotiations with people on whom a lot of things we may disagree. One of the things that's been, I think, demoralizing is to see many more moderate voices on the Palestinian side, the likes of Mahmoud Abbas, undermined or rather not supported, because I think those are the people that it's most likely that we're going to be able to negotiate with. Ultimately, we're only going to resolve these differences, and it takes us back to what we've been talking about in this country through dialogue with people who are different from us. There's no doubt about that. I agree, I'm afraid, with Jonathan and with Mike that at the moment, at least the way in which Hamas presents itself makes it very, very difficult for Israel to engage with an organization which appears not to recognize its right to exist. And that's the difficulty that I have. But what I do think we need to do is strengthen those moderate voices on both sides, because there are extremist voices on both sides. And so the likes of Mahmoud Abbas need to be supported and engaged with in order to broker the solution, which ultimately can only come from the peoples themselves. And one final thing, because this relates back to what we were talking about underlying causes, removing hate. In some ways, politics, I think, is too important to be left to politicians. The political leadership, or the lack of political leadership in parts of the Middle East, I think accounts for the way in which the peoples, both in Israel and in Palestine, have been let down. And so it's not just a question of waiting for our leaders to get along, the leaders that we deserve, but it's also each and every one of us within our communities supporting those moderate voices out there in the Middle East who are interested in peace, doing what we can to bolster their efforts that we're going to get peace.
Thank you very much. Mike, you have the last word.
Okay. Can I just correct the gentleman in terms of the types of legislation and what is being debated in Parliament? Most of Parliament debates government legislation. You are expected to vote for it if you're a government MP. That's the whipping process. When you have a backbench motion, you are free to vote as you choose, unless you're a member of the government, in which case you are meant to absent yourself. Because of my position as a government assistant to one of the ministers, to allow me to vote on that motion, and you can disagree with my voting, I could not remain as a parliamentary aide to a minister. That's why you resign to allow me to vote on a backbench motion. The two types of debates are very separate. But the reason why I did that, and I agree and I'm passionately supporting getting to a peaceful solution. That's why I felt it necessary, because I do not believe that a premature recognition would make peace one step closer. If I genuinely thought peace would have come the next day because of that motion being supported, I'd have voted for it. But I voted against it because not just because of the Hamas issue, because I genuinely and passionately thought it would set the peace process back, not forward. And that's why I stuck by what I believed in and voted the way my heart told me.
Okay, guys, we are going to have to end it at that. We are going to have to call it a day. I apologise. Honestly, I apologise. We were supposed to finish at 4 o'clock, and the candidates have been brilliant. My thanks, honestly, to all of the panelists today. I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job, and I'm sure you'll agree. And thanks to the Masjid for hosting this as well. It's been fantastic. If you're interested in getting involved with MEND, these are the sorts of things we do. Do join our local working groups, and all of the details your local mosque will provide you. Thank you very much, everybody.